Hello, I'm Andrew McInerney, Artistic Director of the Studio de Musique Ancienne de Montreal, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce these pre-concert presentations for our special 45th anniversary season.
Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Jean-François.
So nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Can you tell our listeners who you are?
My name is Rebecca Bain, and I'm the Artistic Director of Ensemble Scholastica.
An ensemble of women?
Women, and we specialize in medieval music.
Oh, wonderful. I'm Jean-François Daignault. I'm the co-founder and co-musical artistic director of Ensemble Alchemia, a vocal trio that often invites other performers to perform music of the medieval era, but really of every
many
era.
eras.
Yeah, exactly. So we're here today to talk about one specific era, the Renaissance.
That's right.
And a concert by Studio de Musique Ancienne de Montréal entitled Dévotion et Plaisir, Devotion and Pleasures. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that program?
Well, there would be really a lot of things to say about the program, and it's an interesting kind of overview of the beginning of the Renaissance right into not the end of the Renaissance, because we associate that with people like
Palestrina, Tallis,
we don't
Byrd.
quite get there, but we covered a lot of ground in this program, and we have both sacred music and secular music.
And it's nice to get music from a little bit earlier in the Renaissance. We don't hear that often enough.
And for people like myself who really specialize in medieval music, we tend to think of what is traditionally thought as the beginning of the Renaissance for music, in terms of music, as still the sort of an extension of late medieval composition. So, for instance, we have the oldest composer for the program is Guillaume Dufay, who was born around 1400, which for people who specialize in medieval music is still the Middle Ages.
You
or
want
it's
to
the
claim
late
it for
Middle Ages.
yourself.
Well, the thing is, Dufay is really a transitional figure.
Right.
So he's got one foot in the end of the Middle Ages and one foot in the Renaissance, and really.
So what year are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about the early 15th century.
So 1425.
Early to mid 15th
mid,
century. I mean, he was
okay.
active until the 1470s.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, he had a good long life and left quite a legacy. I mean, he started out quite young. He was actually discovered when he was 16. I mean, he already had a position singing in the church in Cambrai. He was from the north, but he was discovered by Italians because he was part of the retinue of the Cambrai Cathedral when it went to participate in the Council of Constance, a very important ecclesiastical council. And there he was singing, and he was heard by some Italians who influenced him to come to Italy later on in his life. And in Italy he heard Italian music. He also heard at the council, he probably also heard a lot of English music. And the fact that he had heard and been influenced by all these different styles really helped him inform his own compositional style, which in turn sort of set the tone for the Renaissance. So,
wow.
That's one thing that distinguishes Renaissance music from earlier music, is this sort of more of an internationalization, more an international style, or a pan-European. It's not really international. We're really talking about Western Europe, mostly Western Europe.
Because the Renaissance is a little bit of a... some people say it's the birth of Europe as we know it.
Well,
obviously it's transitional.
That's what they said at the time. Someone like Petrarch, who is a great humanist, yes, he liked to distinguish himself from someone like Dante, who was just a generation prior to him. Even though sometimes Dante is also considered by some people to be proto-Renaissance.
Right.
So it's all a bit complicated, and it depends who you talk to.
Right.
But for music, it really has a different sort of trajectory from the sort of humanist or Italian, because what Dufay represents is also the beginning of what we know as what we call the Franco-Flemish school of composition. He's the first generation, and there are many subsequent generations. But these are all composers who come from the north. So the north, what is today the north of France, Belgium, Flanders, Holland, northern Germany. And who not all of them travel south, but all of them will be influenced by Southern music and also English music, and some of them even make their way to Spain. but it really is a movement sort of coming from the north to the south, or to create this sort of pan-European compositional style, which marks the Renaissance and really sets the tone for the Renaissance, but also distinguish it from earlier music.
So we'll hear a piece by Dufay, I think.
It's Adieu, c'est bon vin de la noix.
Yes.
And this is a piece that Dufay wrote fairly early on in his career, but he'd already traveled a lot. And it's sort of an homage, a sort of nostalgic homage to Laon, which is a city in the north of France. And it's good wine, and obviously he's somewhere else. And he has a kind of nostalgic feeling about the good wine and good times.
It's a beautiful piece. If concert goers can hear one piece by Dufay, I think it should be that one. Personally, it's so beautiful and nostalgic and melancholic. So we have Dufay, we have many other composers.
Yes, we have sort of all the generations of this Franco-Flemish school represented, except the very last. So if there are 5 generations, we have the first 4 represented. And so in the second generation, we also have Loisette Compère, Alexander Agricola, who's a name that most people haven't really heard of.
Oh,
but he
great.
was an important composer at the time and influential.
Yeah, and it's wonderful that we get to hear that music.
Yes.
Congratulations, ma'am. I approve.
But one figure that people may have heard of is Josquin des Prés.
Yes.
And he is very, very important for the history of Western music. And he represents the sort of third generation.
So the middle.
The middle of the Franco-Flemish school. And kind of in some ways, its summit, or up until then, its summit. But also, the really interesting thing about Josquin des Prés is not only was he extremely prolific, and he composed, like most of these composers, both secular and sacred music, but his music was very well known throughout Europe and became known and stayed well known long after his death, in part because this is also the period in European history where they started using the printing press. And the printing press meant you could print music and you could disseminate music a little bit more. And Josquin des Prés was one of the first composers to be printed, and his music was printed a lot. And that really helped disseminate his music. And
so his influence was far and wide throughout Europe.
Yeah, and not just because of the printing press, also because his style was considered sort of the summit, and everyone wanted to emulate his style. But they emulated his style, but they also expanded on it. So subsequent generations, that's why we can talk about subsequent generations and a kind of, an ever-growing, not progress, but different differentiations between the different generations.
Right. One generation influenced the other, and so forth.
Until we get to Palestrina, and then eventually Monteverdi, and then the Baroque period.
Yes. Composers that may be a little bit part of the standard repertoire of SMAM, like Palestrina, Thomas Tallis, Bird. So these are people from generations.
They're the high Renaissance.
Yes.
But
this is the middle.
This is kind of the beginning in the middle. Yeah.
I think I remember hearing or reading an anecdote at one court, I think at the court of Urbino, nobles had heard a motet and were a little, they didn't like it that much. And then when someone told them it was by Josquin des Prés, all of a sudden everyone loved it. Yeah, that's how influential and well-known he was, and beloved. Yes.
He really was beloved. And it's interesting that you mentioned the motet, because that's one of these interesting forms that was already was sort of invented in the 13th century, but it was a completely different type of composition. And into the Renaissance, it started out still being kind of medieval in that it often had many different texts. I mean, that's where the word motet comes from, the French word mot, because you had different texts sung in different voices.
So not every voice would sing the same text.
That's right,
yes.
Yeah. And people like Dufay and even Josquin were still composing some motets that had more than one text. But by the end of the Renaissance, the term motet becomes something altogether different, when that's a sacred song, again, where voices are all singing the same text, but they're sort of more equal. Like we also speak of a kind of democratization of the voicing, whereas in earlier music, say in late medieval and early Renaissance music of Dufay and his colleagues, they composed music that was where the top voice held the melody. It was called the cantus, and the
cantus
other
as
voice,
in chant, singing, yeah,
exactly, and would sing the melody, and often would be the only voice singing actually the text, and the other voices, usually only two voices at during the period, and adding more voices as time went along, would be more like accompanying voices, and they could be sung or played by instruments.
Yeah, I think in the manuscripts, often these two voices don't even have text underneath
they
the
might
notes.
just have the incipit or the very beginning of the text to show you
which
piece it is, right?
melody it's associated. Yeah.
And then towards Josquin's time, and then in subsequent generations, you have music being composed where all the voices sort of share the melody. The melody bounces back through imitation, and there's not one voice that sort of is the leader, if you will. So that's why we speak of a kind of democratization in the voicing. You can't say that one voice is more important than the other.
And one of the ways that happens also is through imitation?
Through imitation, and Renaissance composers are very known for this, using a lot of use of imitation, uses of canon. So one voice starts a melody, and then it's picked up by another, and it sort of bounces around. But sometimes you have actual canons, like you have whole pieces composed.
Like row your boat, or Frère
a
Jacques.
lot more complex than that. In fact, one of the composers in the program, Pierre de la Rue, was very well known for composing quite complex canons and even whole masses that used canon all the way throughout.
Amazing.
Which means that
you're talking about high
he
technical ability.
He probably had a very good, very high math skills too, because it probably involved a lot of calculation.
And if I'm not mistaken, at that time you would never find what today we would call a score, where on one page you will see all the voices in one piece.
That's right. Yes, you each in the manuscript. The way it's laid out is each voice is on its own usually.
Wow.
And sometimes towards the end of the Renaissance, you also had what we call part books. So if you're singing, say, the top voice, then you would have a book with only the top voices of all the pieces.
You don't see all the other. A little bit like orchestral musicians today.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting experiment for performers to try to read from the old notation, where you only have your text and you have to rely a lot on your ear to know where the cadence is coming, where the voices come together, and you're forced to hear the imitation in the other voices. It's a really interesting experiment and a lot of fun, and it takes maybe a little bit more time because we're not used to it, but it would be more authentic, if you will.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
We were getting to Pierre de la Rue, who is interesting, and maybe a name who isn't very well known. He was active sort of in the end of the 15th century, the very early part of the 16th century. And he was one of these Franco-Flemish composers that actually never made it to Italy. But by then, this sort of international style was already well known in the north too. So he
didn't have to travel. Music came to him through manuscripts
he did do
and
some
printing.
traveling, but not quite as much as some of the others. And he never actually made it to Italy, which was kind of unusual. But he wrote a lot of masses, and he wrote these masses that start with that take as their basis a known melody. Sometimes it's called a cantus firmus mass, or an imitation mass, or a paraphrase mass. There are also masses that were called parody masses that would take whole sections of polyphony from earlier pieces, could be secular pieces, and
by other composers,
and create, using that music, create a whole new set of a whole new piece, and a whole new and often used to compose masses. And often they would take, there were also these what they called chansons rustiques, that were kind of like folk songs with very secular texts. Some of them talked about war, some of them talked about drinking, some of them talked about love.
And
a lot of them talked about love.
So I think that's the case for the in this program by SMAM.
Yes, so here we have Pierre de la Rue takes a melody that was very well known. It was originally a Flemish piece, a Flemish kind of folk song called Tandernaken, probably mispronouncing it, but a Flemish piece in which the text talks about, it's a conversation between two young women who are talking about their love life, but it's actually a conversation that's overheard by one of their lovers. So it's kind of got a little twist on that.
So we're definitely in the secular world.
But we are on the program. We are going to hear the original text, but then we'll also hear the melody taken by Pierre de la Rue to compose a mass. But we'll also hear it in instrumental versions. So Tandernaken was one of these Flemish melodies that was used for various composers to compose actual instrumental pieces, and that's an interesting.
That's something new.
It's something new. It's something that distinguishes the Renaissance from earlier periods. Not that you had for the first time instrumental music, because during the medieval period you had a lot of instrumental music. They just didn't tend to write it down for posterity. Maybe a lot of it was improvised. Some of it was accompanying voices or for dance. But in the Renaissance, you have composers sitting down to compose specifically instrumental pieces. So we have, for the first time during the Renaissance, a large repertoire of untexted music that was meant to be played by various types of instruments. Sometimes the instruments are specified. I mean, they had a specific type of notation for lute playing, specific type of notation for keyboards and so on. Sometimes it's not specified. But it is an important difference between the Renaissance and the medieval period in terms of music.
So I think in this program by SMAM, we will hear one version of this, one instrumental version of this Tandanaken.
I think we'll hear more than one.
More than
version.
one, but I'm talking about one specifically that could be of interest because of the composer. Who wrote this one?
You're probably referring to the composition by Henry VIII, who we all know was the monarch who chopped off several of his wives' heads.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
So he's more known for that. But he was also.
But he was a romantic.
He was a romantic. He was a Renaissance man.
Oh,
and I mean,
literally.
it was very common for the nobility and the monarchy to have, a well-rounded education, which included music. Music education wasn't just knowing how to sing and play an instrument, but was also knowing the basics of music composition. Henry VIII went a bit further in that he was obviously a good musician, and he composed quite a few pieces, or at least there are a number of pieces that have been attributed to him. Possibly they weren't all actually written by him. We don't know, but we know that he did compose.
Let's say they were, because it's just too cool.
Maybe they didn't want to have their heads chopped off. And they thought they would attribute. But he was a composer, which is surprising, and he is on the list of the composers for this program. He composed a lute piece on the melody that was originally called Tandanaken.
Wow! So there really is a meeting of sacred music, secular music, even in one piece, like we mentioned, the Mass by Pierre de la Rue, which is based on a folk song, basically. Yeah. So that's
very
definitely...
secular folk song. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's definitely something that makes this concert very special, and we encourage people to, obviously, to go hear it.
I mean, and we will hear other just chansons with... rather, body texts.
Yes.
They talk a lot about drinking, but they also talk, about...
They're sometimes quite graphic about... I think there's one piece where... in the text, it's monks that are talking about drinking, eating.
Nous sommes de l'ordre de Babouin, de Saint-Babouin by Compère, and they're all about, getting up in the morning to pray, but more importantly to drink.
I listened to it, and I if any, it's not for the weak of heart. If you don't want to be shocked, don't read the actual lyrics. Just go and listen to the music. So, thank you so much. I know there would be so many.
There's just so much to say. We didn't even talk about all the composers, but
the other composers we'll hear is Loizé Compère, Agricola. We mentioned Josquin des Prés, Pierre de la Rue,
Clemens non-papa, who is not to be confused with Clemens the Pope. That's why he's non-papa.
That was his name, like to differentiate him, differentiate him from.
And Gombert wrote this piece, Chasse de Lièvre, which is also interesting because the plaisir at the time also included for the nobility, unfortunately. Hunting. The hunting, and this one describes the hunting and has various onomatopoeic the sounds of the animals and the sounds of the shouts of the hunters, the sounds of the I don't know, did they use muskets? But the sounds of
the arrows what so have you,
which they were already composing such songs in the Italian Trecento in the medieval period in the 14th century. They had these caccia, which were very similar to that, but also later on, this type of song will be used a lot in the Renaissance, sort of using more onomatopoeia and then this kind of the excitement of the hunt.
Yes, like pieces by Clément Jeannequin, for instance.
Exactly,
we won't get to hear him.
Yes.
So it's great. We get to hear earlier, lesser-known composers. So I really encourage you to go and don't watch Netflix that night. Go to Dévotion et Plaisir by Studio de Musique Ancienne.
And you'll have just as much fun.
Yes, absolutely. And you get to hear music that's not often performed and that we love, and we'll definitely be there, and we encourage you to be there.
And then afterwards you can go and drink un bon vin.
Yes, exactly. Or before, or maybe during if you're discreet. Enjoy the concert. Thank you so much, Rebecca.